Welcome everyone to the Wednesday morning series. Dr. David Fawcett is joining me today, and I'm not by my normal cupboard, so I can't pull your books. But
Oh,
he's the author of Lust, Men, and Meth, and he's also the author of Sex Under the Influence about sexualized drug use. So the topic that we tend to discuss on this particular webinar series is about co-occurring sex, porn, and substances, whatever form that takes. I will note that Dr. David hosts a drop-in group on Tuesday nights for men who are struggling with some form of compulsive sexual behavior and some form of substances. That's a unique drop-in group. They're free, but that's unique because you're able to talk about everything versus going to 12 step and talking about sex or talking about the substances. So this is a safe place to do that. And Dr. David volunteers his time and hosts that group. So on Seeking Integrity, you'll find those resources. So check that out if that's a fit for you. So without further ado, Dr. David, do you have a topic for us today?
yeah. One I can think that kind of bridges um, that gap between people that may not be substance involved, but to the sort of unique features of the sexualized drug use, where there's substances and sex versus just sex and porn. And I think that's kind of the distinction between intensity and intimacy. I think that's a
Mm,
bridge that crosses both lines, but I think it's more obvious initially with the drugs, which is why I think just because the drugs themselves are such mood changers, but the same phenomenon is happening with sex and porn addiction as well. And the same impact on partners happens as well. And so I just wanted to kind of draw the distinction just to illustrate that really
okay,
briefly and then
I,
see what
I
happens.
appreciate that. Yeah.
And I also wanted to just mention there's a third book coming out. It's
Oh,
a study guide that is for Less Men Enough. The first book I did is now being kind of updated, and it's kind of a workbook that goes with it. So that should be coming out later this month, actually,
oh,
on
great. Oh,
Amazon.
fantastic. All right,
Uh,
good.
I'll keep you posted.
Yes,
So,
please.
what we often hear, and this used to happen all the time to Seek Integrity with clients too, we talk about the difference between or the confusion about what people think is intimacy, and it's really intensity. And people get really hooked on the intensity piece, thinking this is intimacy. And there's characteristics that kind of
Mhm.
can help you identify. So I want to start with the intensity first. And by the way, the intensity is neurochemical. And with drugs, it happens most frequently with drugs that cause this huge release of dopamine. And those are often the amphetamines. So cocaine, methamphetamine, crack cocaine, even the ADHD medications can have some of that effect and can be abused like that. But they create this like slam of intensity, and so they're fast. It's one of the ways that gets reflected is this fast bonding. Is the idea, much the way a love addict might fall in love with someone, like, wow, found my life partner in 30 minutes. Let's move forward with our lives all tangled up together. It's just that quick, almost too quick, right? That real fast bonding. There's oftentimes in sex addiction world, we talk about trauma bonding and how people can really connect with each other over a past shared history of trauma, right? And how those wounds kind of attract one to the other, which doesn't always make for the healthiest kind of connection, because you're really connecting with the other person based on what hurts, and what has been your negative life experiences in the past, as opposed to not. So there's the fast bonding. The intensity often leads to kind of big declarations like "you're the one," or "this is amazing." This is kind of a lot of superlatives, uh, overestimating, I think, the intensity of the moment, the feelings of the moment, and this is where people aren't making this up. People feel that if they're in that space, they really are feeling it. It's not just that they're. I know certainly sex addicts are well known for gaslighting, but there are situations where they believe it themselves as well. And so I think this is a bit of that, where that intensity piece is really on fire. So another thing goes with intensity. We see this as a hallmark of addiction: the need for novelty, newness, the need for ever increasing intensity. What was exciting and thrilling, last week is like, this week we need to do something to kind of make it more exciting. And so you see this very quick progression. I know with, let's say, alcohol, there's been studies, it takes, I don't know, something like 17 years for an alcoholic to go from like first drink to full-fledged alcoholic on average. With these amphetamines and with sex addiction, it can happen in a matter of months. It's very, very fast. And that's because of this intensity piece and the need for novelty and the tolerance, what we call tolerance develops where, that we're not getting the kick that we did before. So we kind of escalate the behavior. And that goes into risk taking, doing really stupid things that seem to make sense in the mind of the addict, right? Um, that sense that we're closer than ever. Again, it's a kind of a chemical. When we are engaged in these behaviors, it's not only dopamine, but serotonin is released. Serotonin makes us feel comfortable and um, kind of a warm blanket kind of feeling. Oxytocin, all these chemicals that are very much at play in love and romance addiction as well. There's some urgency about it that feeds the intensity. It's like we have to act on this now. And these high highs that end up into this low, low, right? This kind of up, up, up into the sky, and then it crashes. So it's not steady, it's not even. It's these jagged peaks and valleys, up and down, as people kind of succumb to that intensity cycle, if you will. Now, often people, when feel they're experiencing that, they think I'm really feeling intimacy. And intimacy is very different. Now, there's some characteristics I think of intimacy. Actually, I think Family Seek Integrity still offers it, that kind of intimacy and healthy sex workshop. I think Scott teaches it.
Yes. Hmm.
Yeah, that's a really important place to get some of these skills too for the recovering addict. Um, but so, what are some of the hallmarks of that? Of intimacy? True intimacy is trust over time, right? And this is where I think our partners often are, that sense of betrayal, because that relationship is often developed over time, and so that trust is also slowly developed, and then to have it kind of all pulled out from under you in a moment's notice is incredibly damaging and hurtful. But intimacy is built over time. True intimacy, it's showing up, and this is another distinction: showing up, and not just showing up high, not just showing up for the good parts and the fun part, but showing up all the time, right? Through consistency, when times are tough, when things are sad, when something difficult has to be stated. Those kind of moments that an addict is, I think, over the hallmark of an addict is avoiding, right? We avoid those tough conversations, the tough feelings. Um, and there's this ludicrous calculus in the brain, I think, of an addict that says, well, if I just say this or that, that's not even true, that's easier than having the hard truth, right? Those conversations. So that's all kind of screwy, I think, and it goes with that long-term pattern of avoidance and the addict. Listen, I don't want to go there. I'll do anything to avoid, talking about that. So talking up even when it's uncomfortable is one of the hallmarks of intimacy. Um, Sex that's present, and this is another thing when we talk about sex itself, sex that's present, connected, but not necessarily always epic, right? I think an addict, or especially a chemsex addict, goes through this, like, fireworks every time and is always the best. And again, all the kind of grandiose stuff. And sometimes sex over the long haul is sex. Sometimes it's great, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's awkward, sometimes it's funny, sometimes it doesn't work. It's we're human beings, and it's messy emotionally, but that's what kind of makes it wonderful as well. So I think if our goal is always this kind of firework moments, that's we're setting ourselves up for some disappointment. Repair. I think true intimacy opens the door to the possibility of repairing after that rupture in the relationship, or after the damage is done. Not always, and then that's certainly a decision both parties have to come to, or not. But I think if we're just talking about intensity, there's nothing there to repair, right? It's there's no emotional involvement. And then finally, I think, building on what I said before, choosing transparency, being transparent in the relationship over secrecy, over compartmentalizing, over having two or three or four lives, but just really being transparent and consistent over time. So those things, as I describe them, sound like, of course, they are polar opposites, but it's surprising how easy it is for the addict, especially, to kind of mix that up and feel that, gee, I'm really having this intimate moment, when no, they're having a very mood altered moment because of drugs and behaviors. Um, So I think that was just one way. I see that a lot with the drugs I mentioned, but I think that's true of all sex addiction in general and the impact it has on partners as well. So,
Yeah, and Dr. Eddie did he ever really love me last week? And this feels
uh,
like, because like you talk about the intensity, and I was thinking, and the novelty, and I was like, yeah, I love you. We need to be together forever until next week when like that's diminished. And now there's another person that, oh my gosh, you're the best, and even
right,
like the chasing the fireworks, like you're talking about, but I feel like it's a hard sell, for addicts to go from, oh my gosh, this is so amazing, including the low lows, but like I'm only focusing on the high highs,
right,
to be willing to go to, you're telling me that it's going to be mediocre, like that feels really blah when I've had this just amazing stuff, but I feel like the addict brain is really quick to ignore all the really low lows. Like I'm going to constantly seek that high intensity and
right.
forget about, yeah, but when you're in the, in the bottom of the, like in the bottom of the well because things are so low, oh, I ignore that because I'm still going after this. So, how do you work with clients to help them reframe?
Right. Such a important point because we all have that euphoric recall, right? We remember the high highs and the good part, and very selectively, forget the pain and misery and hurt and all that. Those moments at the end of usually the end of the addictive cycle where we're regretting and feeling shame and all that. That we don't want to remember that stuff. Um, I have found it's really useful to bring together partners and or addicts over the long haul with different amounts of sobriety, because I think the weight of the words of somebody who's lived it is so much more powerful than a therapist talking about what the process is going to be. And I think when people can see a couple that's really made a go of it and has really healed, and remember, this is a long-term window. We talk about what, a 5-year window sometimes to really get that healing. Probably, and I'm not even going to say back to where it was. I would say probably far beyond where it ever was, right?
I
And
agree.
but I think what happens then, there's a certain real beauty and intimacy and intensity of its own kind in that long-term relationship where we've gone through ups, we've gone through downs, we've been honest, we've showed up for each other and had wonderful moments and not so wonderful moments, and but that to hear people talk about it over time, the good, the bad, but that consistency, the transparency, the honest, the communication, the sense of being a team, if you will, I think that is far more satisfying than the very brief high highs. And you talk to any addict, by the way, and after a while, they can't even get to that high high. It's just a memory of the high high, right? That's elusive. They can't go there anymore because literally the brain can't do it. So, I mean, that's all fantasy anyway. And to think that's something very real, and it's just and of course addicts quick and easy, right? And that takes work. It takes work and time and patience and all that stuff that addicts aren't so good at. But I think, yeah, that's what I try to do is just say that, yeah, it's not going to be 100 miles an hour all the time, but it's going to be a steady and pleasant 50 or 60 miles an hour, and with over time that has the possibility for all kinds of other wonderful feelings that go with it. So it's
And I agree because it's like jumping across the mountaintops. It's like boom, 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 and we're missing the vistas along the way, And but I do feel like it is hard, for an addict to buy into like this will be so much better if you're just willing to do the work and experience it. And I'm with you with, talking to couples, like if someone says, I want what we used to have, and I'm like, but if the addict partner was lying to you and there wasn't like I would hope that you would want more than that you would want
right.
that security and honesty and along the way, and like you said, all of the stuff that we're terrified of uncomfortable feelings and vulnerability and all of those things. Eek, but gosh, when we're willing to do the work and to just, just show up, things start to get different. And without the low lows, all the baggage of the shame, the toxic stuff, that goes along with, trying to compartmentalize and keep, all of those balls in the air is what, while we're, doing problematic behavior. So, but
And also I think that allows, if we expand the time window, right, to look at this over a period, not just weeks or months, but even years, what really has to happen there, part of the work I think is for both parties, but I've done more work as the addict and with addicts, but to really do the work on themselves, their relationship with themselves and all their beliefs about themselves and deserving or not, and feeling, almost every addict, despite their kind of outrageous behavior sometimes, will, feel basically unlovable or unworthy or all these negative beliefs about themselves. And if those beliefs aren't challenged, or if the addict doesn't kind of heal past that, that's a real setup for relationship failure, right? Because at some point, and I've seen partners feel the same way, by the way, then suddenly we're feeling it's not working for us, and it'll never work, and then that opens the window to these kind of fantasy thoughts, I think, and playing around the edges instead of facing the reality of it. But I think that work on oneself is really essential to make one ready for a relationship.
yeah, and I'm with you. And most people don't do the work before they get into a relationship because there's all those little chemicals that are going off and like, oh, that person's perfect for me, and we can miss the big red flags. And okay, so now you're in a relationship, but I love what you're talking about with doing the work because even in the best of relationships, I don't know of any couples that where they are. I hate the Jerry Maguire, you complete me like that. That is
I know.
like, no, but that is the worst line in movies, in my opinion. You guys
I
can
believe it.
think differently,
Yep,
but it's one of those things where I'm like, no, I need to be, I need to fill the holes in my bucket before I'm looking for other people to pour into it. Otherwise it's just going to keep running out. And for
exactly.
it's a setup for, if I am counting on you to show up and do everything that I need, again, it's a setup, for failure. And for an addict, it'll be a setup for, oh, I can justify my, like this isn't enough and that you don't understand me. So therefore, like all of those things, I'm not giving excuses. I'm just saying, like that's the
No, that's
patterns
right.
that can happen. So,
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. And people really need to be willing to see that. And that's challenging, right? It's much easier to focus on the other person and what,
oh yeah,
all
yeah,
the wrongs and that, justified resentment, all that stuff that we have. Um,
yes.
and that, I think, by the way, can also be a trap for the partner, because I think partners obviously have been, betrayed, and there is justified anger there, which is kind of a little bit of a rush itself, right? It feels kind of good to get in touch with that and be angry. And anger is an okay feeling for a while, but the danger is getting trapped in it. And then it becomes unhealthy for everybody, but especially the person carrying it. So I think that's the trick, I think, especially for partners, to feel that, not just anger, but all the feelings that go with it, and express them, move the feeling, get it out, and then see what's there. But I think it's so easy to kind of hang on to that anger, um and that just really is painful for everybody, but especially the partner holding it after a while.
And I hear that. I've actually heard too many cases in the last week where people are, I really do feel, trapped in, that toxic place, and yes, anger is a wonderfully powerful emotion. And if I'm mad at you, I'm not experiencing the hurt for me. It's an outward,
Exactly. Exactly.
emotion. And yes, and moving through them, anger is part of grief. Like there's such a huge amount of grief that goes along with the betrayal. And even for the addict, there's grief, the grief of the loss of giving up my maladaptive coping mechanism, having to take ownership of all, and responsibility for what I've like there's a whole bunch of grief and for both sides of a relationship in all of this. So, and anger is part of that. So, but like as you say, getting stuck in any particular place, we advocate for people to get the help and support resources to move forward, move through, not minimizing, like that's real and valid, but let's keep moving through. Dr. Eddie, I'll bring him up again, but he quoted Dr. Gabor Mate and the gist of it is whatever has happened, you can't make unhappen, but what you do with it today and how you choose to move forward, that you do have control over. And that's where the trauma is if I'm constantly replaying, that
Right.
and getting stuck in that. So,
Exactly.
I was thinking, I don't even know why this morning when I was out for a walk, but, of Kristen Snowden's, the post traumatic embitterment, phase and like and identifying people partners getting embittered because of the betrayal and what like addiction takes so much from people already, so to have it be that added now, I'm physical ailments, the exhaustion, the stress, embitterment, whatever it is, at some point stopping and saying, I am going to choose to do something different so that I can move forward, regardless of what has happened. It happened. So,
Yeah.
again, not minimizing any of the pain or the problems with this. We hope every addict chooses to be on a healing path. We hope every partner chooses to be on a healing path, and everybody gets to choose their path. So. I did put the healthy intimacy group. That is not where you start if you have struggled with sex or porn addiction, and don't have a solid foundation of recovery yet. Start with Sex Addiction 101. That'll start again, I think, January 6th. But I put the link for the work groups. We also have in January both the boundaries, trust and connection with Debbie McCrae, and the betrayed partner work group starting with Angela Spearman. But and there's a whole list. They're all listed. You can sign up. Those are psychoeducation. They're not therapy. They're not treatment. Those are just supplemental. Many therapists recommend them for their clients, but low cost, high impact. But the healthy intimacy would be great if you've been on this road for a while and you're struggling with, what is intimacy and things. So. Okay, Dr. David, the first question is, and we would love more questions, so please type them in. My SA partner went to see sex workers, and I can see dopamine and adrenaline happening with him with those experiences, but I'm having trouble understanding where serotonin or oxytocin would be involved if it's not true into some intimacy. Does the brain get tricked from the fantasy part of it, or was he getting those comfort hormones from me and other hormones from his fantasies? That's a great question, and trying to unpack all of the all of the chemicals that are going on.
Yeah. So someone's described the midbrain, which is the section of the brain where all these neurochemicals start and where emotions live and where addiction live. It's not the rational brain, but this midbrain deep, deep in the brain. And they described it as a windowless room with no clocks, no windows. And so all that little closed place in our brain is totally dependent on signals coming in, data coming in. And it's not necessarily real data happening. It's can be fantasy. It can be memories. It can be other things that trigger that and kind of fool the brain into releasing those chemicals in a way. Now, the real life experience often has more chemicals, but fantasy, we talk with our clients all the time. You may not be getting the full hit of dopamine when you start on your addictive ritual, right? But when you start planning or thinking about it or obsessing or looking at sites online or whatever, I mean, that you're getting those chemicals, it's already starting to flow. And there's actually been tests where people their pupils have already changed size, and there's physiological things happening, even though in reality nothing's happened yet. And so the fantasy can induce those chemicals. Dopamine and adrenaline are the big ones. Serotonin, though, is often there as well. And serotonin, again, makes us kind of comfortable, and that can be from the fantasy or from the experience. Oxytocin is also can be just kicked off by touch. You can get a hug from someone, and that can be oxytocin. It doesn't have to be love per se. Oxytocin is a bonding chemical that helps us kind of attach to people, and it's blind. It doesn't have a value judgment on is this person forever or somebody I just met or whatever. And as I say, even a hug from someone can give us a little jolt of oxytocin. So yeah, these kind of anonymous situations or hookup situations even can induce a lot of that chemical flow in the brain that kind of mimic those experiences, which is why people think it's real. I mean, this is really happening. For a moment, they get fooled. Now, their rational brain, which also kind of goes offline, by the way, the midbrain takes over in a way. It's starting running the show, and the smart adult in the room has stepped away. So people are at the mercy of these chemicals, and all the bad judgment that goes with that. But yeah, it doesn't have to be real love. It doesn't have to be leftover serotonin from something else. It can be from these basically artificial moments, right? I'll call them that induce very real chemical responses. And so it kind of tricks the brain in a way. So yeah, it's very real chemical stuff, but just not as limited as you might think in terms of true love or a real relationship.
So what I hear you saying, and I want to clarify, is is it reality that all of those chemicals are going to show up, or are some of them going to be dominant, or some of them going to show up, like dopamine's going to show up now and serotonin won't, in certain situations?
Yeah, so almost always in what we're talking about with these intensity addictions, with
Hmm.
sex, porn, chemsex, it's almost always dopamine and adrenaline.
Okay.
And then serotonin in lesser degrees, but never as much as dopamine. And I would say oxytocin can show up or not, um,
Okay.
depending on the circumstances and what people are, you know, role play and love and romance addict, of course, that oxytocin through the roof. So, so it depends on the circumstances in a way. But for these addictions in general, it's always dopamine and adrenaline. I think if we then really break it down, there's all kinds of neurochemicals going on. It's not just those are the ones we talk about in a very simplified way, but it's actually a much more complex kind of cascade of neurochemicals that are going on and producing these mood changes that um, are very addictive. Just they're very seductive, and so people want to repeat the experience, and get really trapped and caught up in that very very quickly. And what there's a term I'm seeing around now, and I had not seen it before, but I think it's an accurate one. And that's this idea of dopamine depletion disorder. That's not a real diagnosis, but I think it makes sense as a concept. And that just means that we are doing things our dopamine is running dry all the time. And, with a sex addict or porn addict or cocaine addict, right, it just uses it up clearly. But when we get into, things what we call like not porn or even FaceTime or Instagram or TikTok or just these things that kind of bleed away our dopamine because they're getting in we're getting little hits of dopamine all the time. And it turns out it's very distracting. It's like really bad ADHD. So you can't put the brain kind of forgets how to hold a
Mhm.
through line of thoughts, right, with consistency and follow through on a topic. We start to feel very fatigued. There's a whole syndrome that goes with that. And I think a lot of what we see is really this dopamine depletion disorder thing going on. And I think the only way to handle that is really to do a digital detox, which I've been wanting to do myself just to experience it, and I've been afraid to. so, so don't listen to me, but these are concepts. But I think sometimes that's I think the remedy is to just put the phone down for a while, and that's hard. It's really hard for all of
Well,
us.
it is hard, especially in a working world, but yes, there would be the non-working hours that, I'm 100% sure do some editing on. But that's really so you have talked in the past about like the dopamine receptors and with substances with stimulants that they get burned out with intensity seeking in general. Does that also happen, or is it a chemical response?
Great question. So, um, with methamphetamine, especially, it's neurotoxic to those dopamine receptors, meaning if somebody's using a lot of meth consistently, they're frying their dopamine receptors. They're actually killing them, which inhibits obviously the brain's ability to distribute dopamine, which results in really severe depression. Meth users have this idea of after partying all weekend. Tuesdays are suicide Tuesdays because there's no
Mm.
dopamine left after the weekend of partying. So that's one thing. So that's really almost specific to meth users. The bigger picture, though, with really universal to porn users, to sex addicts, to other stimulant users, the brain gets all kind of hopped up on all this dopamine, and it's always seeking what we call homeostasis, right? Trying to regulate itself. It's all dysregulated. And so the only way it can do that with this excess dopamine is to do what's called dopamine downregulation, which is the brain itself will kill off those dopamine receptors. So there's not as
Oh.
many around, so that it's like kind of just less dopamine sort of sloshing around the system. And so over time, as a way of just managing all the excess dopamine, that's what it does. The problem then is when we get into recovery, right? All of a sudden we stop the amphetamines, or we stop the porn, we stop the sexual acting out. The brain is already kind of adapted to that massive input of dopamine, and now it's not getting enough. And so people go into this thing we call anhedonia, which means literally the inability to experience pleasure. So everything's gray and food doesn't taste good and your dog doesn't love you and blah blah blah. It's just the world is this is hope. This is the hopeless phase. Nobody ever gets better. Nobody can do this. If they're doing it, they're lying. I'm never going to get better. I'm worthless. And this kind of gray area. That's a brain thing, and it's temporary because the good news is the receptors do regenerate. Now it can take some months to do that, but I mean, the good news is that they do come back. But there is this kind of trough, if you will, in early recovery because the brain has already killed a bunch of its own dopamine receptors, where the brain is actually starved for enough dopamine, ironically, because it had way too much for so long. So we're really doing a number on our brains when we are involved. And that's why people think, I'm not taking drugs, I'm just a sex addict. Well, that the brain is equally impacted by sex and porn addiction from this point of view, as if you were taking substances. Very dramatic.
So the difference, what I hear though, is if I've killed them off with, like, if I've literally fried them, versus they're in there, they're just, they're muted. So I'm thinking that the period of time that is the downside would be less probably if I haven't literally fried them. Is that
Yes. So,
okay?
so, and it's all, there's no like standard time frame here to give you because it's so variable. But for a sex and porn addicts, the recovery period is going to be much shorter than for a meth user. We know from research at the National Institutes of Health, a meth user takes up to 24 months to get those back. I think a sex and porn addict would be much, much quicker. And without the severity, although they'd certainly feel it, that especially the anhedonia, people just not feeling, and this especially focuses on sober sex, right? It's like we talked about this earlier in this hour, where the high highs of the sex, the intensity, and all the fireworks and stuff. People compare this gray, nothing sounds good or tastes good or looks good moment. And sex, of course, is going to be. I've had clients. point a finger in my face and say, you're dooming me to a life of vanilla, boring, or no sex, right? That's kind of, they think they're never going to be able to enjoy sex again, which isn't true. But they're never in that space. They don't think they're going to be able to enjoy anything again. The world looks pretty bleak for a period of time.
Well, and that's what, earlier when I was saying it feels like it's a hard sell to go, no, it's going to be great. You're just going to go through all of this, and I suspect that it isn't like, one day you're, in Anhedonia, the next day you're going like, oh, I feel good again. Like that the veil is starting to lift, that the gray is getting lighter, so that they
Yeah,
would be able to see some progress along the way, from the almost oppressive, state that they were in. So,
exactly. And by the way, the one thing's variable that we know is the younger you are, the faster they regenerate.
of
Like that's
course,
probably with everything, right?
the gift of
Uh,
youth. Yeah.
so
So,
us old guys have a little bit of a
yeah.
longer wait. Yeah, yeah.
Well, but I cracked up because you said like 17 years for, alcohol. And one of mine is alcohol. But I was like, oh, way to be an overachiever. Like, yeah, I do believe that, for those of us that were able to get into recovery earlier, you know there was a little bit easier bounce back on some of the aspects, physically anyway, than could be for others, but we didn't do maybe quite as much damage along the way. So, okay, so then thanks for answering my question about hormones involved in acting out. I find the science behind it all helping me with a betrayal trauma, especially knowing part of his brain went offline, although it still hurts. Absolutely. But and I do think, I mean, that's why we offer all these resources. None of this is an excuse. This is not like, oh, it's not his fault or whatever. It's like, this is what happened. And in recovery, we take responsibility that yes, my brain was offline. I made horrible choices. I was compartmentalized. I did all of these things. But now in recovery, I'm looking to do things in a very different way and make sure that I'm not, letting my thinking part of my brain going offline.
I find this um, dipping into the science a little bit with the addict very useful, especially if people are really burdened with a lot of shame. Um, just and I'll say toxic shame, because the shame is not always bad, right? I think we need to have a little bit of shame sometimes, but that shame spiral where people just where it suddenly merges with those beliefs, I'm unlovable, I'm a terrible person, that that's a bad place to be. And so I think if people can understand, yeah, this your brain was kind of driven to do some of this. It wasn't all you, although as you say, Tammy, we have there's a fine balance because we have to always the addict has to take responsibility. They're the ones that did it. Their brain didn't make them do it, and they it was the reverse. Their actions made the brain do what it did. So, but I think it does help to understand these are. It's more than just willfulness or not, or being a bad person or whatever. There's some brain stuff going on here too.
There's a lot. It's so compartmentalized too, and like all of those compartments. But I do believe that yes, I didn't feel like I had any choice. I couldn't get myself out of that loop. I literally could not get myself out of that loop. I needed other people, 12 step, therapists, all of that stuff, and I finally had the lifeline to be able to get out of that and choose to do things differently. And
Yeah.
it's worked for me one day at a time for a while, and I'm grateful for that. So, but and I've said to some addicts, like they've had horrific upbringings, young, terrible things, and for some, I think the only way they were able uh, to physically live to adulthood was using a maladaptive coping mechanism. Now, has it turned around and bit them terribly? Sure, but like things were so bad, if they hadn't had an escape mechanism, I don't know that they would have made it. But and there's so much with the science. I really do find it fascinating as well, and ultimately, I know that for those of us that choose this journey, take willingly take on doing the work on a daily basis. I often I have a nice chip, from coin from for my recovery program, but I still have today. Like this is, I have today. This is, I choose today what I'm going to do. And so that takes out that always and forever and nevers and all of those. They did not serve me well early on. I got real caught up in the, I'll never be able to, or, I'll always have to. And I just was like, oh,
Yeah.
no, actually, I didn't. They told me and I listened and they said, just today, just today.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, I can do it just today. Well, and that breaking it down, and I love what you're talking about with healthy shame too. John Taylor talked about that on a webinar. Check it out. But because I've always been in the shame is, toxic and all of this, but he was like, well, there's healthy shame, and sometimes we call it guilt instead of whatever. But yes, there are things that will motivate us to not. But I know Dr. Rob talks with clients in our residential treatment program. If they go, oh, I'm so terrible and all that, and how self-focused that can continue to be. So it's finding that, yes,
Yeah.
I take responsibility. I don't want to do those things again. So how am I going to learn to do things in a different way so that I don't? So,
Yeah.
but I love what you're talking about too, with all this with the brain, because like even in the worst case, like I fried off all my dopamine receptors, the brain can heal. Like so if it can change. It doesn't have to, be this, end of everything.
You said something else too. I just want to highlight because I think it's so important, and that is that in a way our addictions make sense. I mean, they didn't come out of nowhere, and I think in many cases they were a survival strategy that they made sense at some point in our lives, right? That would mean that they're not a good choice, they're terrible costs, but they also help us navigate through certain things. And it may be just the fact that dissociating, disconnecting, just stepping out of my emotional life that I have no resources to deal with and just into this like fantasy world uh, as an escape valve in my life. So I think that also is helpful to, um, it's not that these are bad people necessarily. It's that this was a coping. We used that word before. This is a coping mechanism. That is it a good one? No, but it might have been the only one available for a while until people know better, right? And the gift of program is that it'll ruin whether we can pick up recovery or not. But I think everybody's addiction is kind of ruined once they get exposed to recovery because like the game is up, right? We see what's going on. We can still play it, but it's hollow. It doesn't work as well. But I think hopefully people would choose to say, well, that didn't work so well. Let me try something different and jump into recovery full force. But I think I think those even self-destructive actions kind of made sense at some point in our crazy lives, that we have.
Okay, for me, it was the only thing I knew. I like it. It was working for me until it really, really
Until it
wasn't.
wasn't. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
but then by the time I knew it wasn't, I also couldn't stop. I absolutely like I tried, and that was not successful, until I got the help. And you talked about the people, it wrecks the acting out behaviors. And like I have unfortunately seen people who have all of this knowledge and things and go into such a deep place of denial that they're like, nope, that's not, like they've gone to 12 step, they've done the deal for a while, and then they change and they go, nope, nope, that was just a big lie, and whatever. And I can only imagine the depth of denial that it takes to hold on to the belief that this is okay now, when I was on this path. I'm sure you've seen it as well.
And one of the big, um, I guess, stages of recovery is that kind of bargaining phase, right? And I think we see this a lot, or I see it a lot now with the substance side of I'll pick and choose which substances I want to get clean from. We've had this conversation many times before. Um, so people hang on to their cannabis or their poppers or mm, alcohol if amphetamines are the problem. And I think all of it is very slippery slope that leads right back to the same place, which is a bad place. But I think a lot of people that's kind of the conversation they're having with themselves. Well, I can, meth is what really brought me to my knees, but all this other stuff is okay until it's not. But yeah, so that's where hopefully people have um, honest people in their lives that can give them straight feedback. I think because I think people can fool themselves. I've seen entire groups, 12-step groups, get kind of seduced by that thinking, and they're all saying crazy stuff, from that point of view. So, but it happens.
So interestingly, I had two people the other day that talked about, like what do we think of harm reduction, and this was from the treatment standpoint, and I was like, well, our program, we don't permit smoking or vaping because you're 9 times more likely to relapse on anything else. So I said, we're really looking across everything. And from a 12-step standpoint, like if I want to be happy, joyous, and free, I have to choose to eliminate the problematic behaviors across the board. If I'm hanging on to something, and like you said, okay, I'm not going to do cocaine, but I'm going to do cannabis. I'm still going to be offline. My brain is still going to be doing all of the things, and I'm never going to address, the things I'm using the maladaptive coping mechanisms for. Now, that sounds like, well, okay, then I don't have to go to that messy place. But then we don't get, there's promises that are listed in the 12-step book, and they're amazing and they come true, and it says before we will be amazed before we're halfway through. And it lists a whole bunch of things. None of those happen if we are hanging on to those other things, So it really, the gift of real recovery is so worth it. But, it is difficult when people go, well, that's the problem. This other stuff is, this is the problem. And if I just stop this, and I hear this from partners too, well, they stopped this, but they're still drinking or, whatever, they're gambling, whatever, they're still doing all of those. And I'm like, well, then they're keeping that, that line going, so
Exactly.
that they haven't given up the intensity, and so they aren't going to be able to create intimacy, because they're still doing whatever.
Right. Right. And this, I think there has to be a pretty clean line, right? It's really hard to mix and match and kind of coax your way into recovery and intimacy and all that. If you're, as you say, I think the brain can't be in two places at once. I think if we're using those substances, they're all dissociative. Addiction disconnects us from our lives. And it's really hard to be building our lives and building lives with other people that are based on vulnerability and trust and communication and all that if we're half checked out all the time. Um, so yeah, I totally agree with that.
Well, and even to your point about digital detox, like this can be, another form of escape. And, and
Totally.
now, yeah, so in the list of things, if you're doing high risk substances and high risk sex, of course, those would be the most, problematic, versus, I spend too much time on TikTok or whatever, so there can be a, peeling the layers away, but to go, well, I'm going to hang on to the drinking wasn't really a problem, but as we often talk about, if you drink, can you guarantee that your actions will keep, that you won't go do something else? And, and if so, great, but if there's a every time I drink, or sometimes when I drink, then all of a sudden I find myself doing these other things,
Exactly.
then it
Yeah.
might be part of the problem. So
Right.
how do we navigate that space? I think one of the huge things for me was pain, because I kept feeling like I had to give up everything, like everything that I had a lot of drama. Everything that mattered to me in my life, I was giving up. And what I mean, I really pretty quickly figured out, and because they promised me, they being, these people that actually were ahead of me on this journey, they said, we promise you, if you, are willing, you will be, like good things will happen. And, it won't feel like you've given up, like what you've given up is so little compared to what you get. And they were right, but it's hard when you have your head down going, no, I need to hang on to this. So,
Yeah. Yeah, for sure, for sure.
Other questions for us? We've got a few more minutes left. We would welcome questions. Obviously, Dr. David and I can chat. So your new book that's coming out, it'll be available on Amazon. Let's talk about that a bit. So this is a revision of Less Men and Math and then a workbook.
It's right. So it's Less Man Enough is 9 years old, and it was a little dated. Some of the HIV science and stuff has moved on, and so I it was time for an update. So there's a basically a chapter in the beginning of the book where I update um, where it's not just meth, but a lot of other drugs are involved now. It's not just gay men. It's a lot of other people now, including a lot of straight men and straight women for that matter too. So it's a much broader experience now. So that's some of that. And then I've co-authored with this gentleman named Dallas Bragg, who is a recovery coach, and he created exercises for each of the chapters. I created a review of the chapter with high points, and then he did, and everything from just general questions, and they're useful actually for book study groups or peers for
Good idea.
group settings, right?
Yeah.
There's journal prompts, and so it's really, I think, is an update, and it's a really very useful way to translate the information into practice. So I'm excited about it.
I could see this really helpful for therapists that are working with clients, as well. Um, I would anticipate, like if they're offering groups, that would be a good text for them to use.
This came about actually because this guy Dallas had written to me. He was doing a group for chemsex recovery and said, "Look, I'm doing a little study guide around your book. Is that okay?" He wanted my permission, which I appreciated. I said, "Sure." And then we got to talking. It's like, well, maybe that would be useful as a book, to sort of make it a real thing. And which, so we did. That was the initial spark of it. It's been a lot of work since then, but yeah, it's coming out shortly. So I'm excited about
I'm
it.
excited about that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So then there's a question. Any experience with AI chatbots? Some of my sponsees struggling a lot, and like I am hearing more and more AI, yeah, challenge. Now, I hear been a few things, with some AI that has been like a good accountability or whatever, but I'm hearing more and more, challenges with AI in this arena. Are you seeing that too?
Yeah, I am. I have, and it's just the very beginning of it, but I'm having clients kind of just mention it that they're using AI as kind of a accountability partner um, during the week, or even I had one guy who was upset about a relationship, and he uploaded all the text messages between himself and this other person and wanted an analysis of it. So it's just really, they're depending on this kind of artificial AI, right, for wisdom, and AI is smart from a book learning point of view, but an AI famously lacks empathy or judgment or kind of human emotional capacity or intelligence. And so I think sometimes there's a real danger of getting skewed or just wrong or unhelpful information. And there's been, of course, the famous cases of AI because it wants to please the person, kind of almost talking them into suicide or helping them with those kind of things, just that hopefully a human being would not do. So yeah, I think it's just the Wild West right now. And it's so accessible and so common and so seductive. It seems like, wow, this is, this genie in my phone that can answer all my questions and give me great advice. And I think we just have to, and what I think what's happening, I encourage people just to not surrender, don't outsource their brains, right? That their good judgment, their common sense, does this make sense? And that's, I use AI right now too, just myself in terms of just, if I have an idea about something, I'm going to write an article about this or that. Just, what is some key points? I'll ask it. And then I can apply my own judgment. Does this list make sense or not? What's missing? And just, it's a way to compare notes, but we don't, use it as the baseline wisdom to follow with our lives. I hope, but I do see a lot of people doing that. And now these AI boyfriends and girlfriends and these relationships that, and again, all this stuff that we're talking about today, these addictions are all about dropping into fantasy space, right? And disconnecting from reality in our real lives. And those things just encourage people to go deeper into that fantasy space. It's just totally disconnected from other human beings, which is scary to
That's
me.
and I appreciate that you said my sponsee. So I was like, well, at least they're connected to a sponsor. But yeah, I'm hearing a whole lot of people that are ignoring the connection with other people and the learning that other people have done, and accountability because they're just using technology. And I feel like that is more of the same. I'm still disconnected from people because I'm using this. And it's like, well, it's
Yep,
great because like, it's so handy and like all of the things that you were mentioning, but it still
yeah,
is not. I don't have to go to a 12-step meeting because I've got this. I don't have to call my sponsor because I've got this. So I can even tell me what I should say to my partner that, well, whatever. I've actually
exactly.
heard the same thing too about the text, like where they compile the whole. I was just like, oh my gosh, Anyway, okay. So
Yeah.
two more questions. How can someone who has been addicted to porn and masturbating for years and it evolved to an affair that got discovered? When the affair got discovered, he admitted to the porn and depression, etc. But my question is, how can he stop all of the from day to day? Is it possible in reality, having difficulty believing he can stop just like that? And I'm going to say, no, no, he can't stop just like that. Like as we were sharing, there's a whole bunch of things like, porn. We have a porn addiction 101 online work group. I put the link for the work groups. It's 12 step. It's all of this. And Dr. David, alluded to it earlier. Real recovery takes 2 to 5 years. So this won't be just like, oh, stop. That's just abstinence. And it doesn't, it doesn't, all of the shifts change over time. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. And I think we aim at stopping the behaviors. Now, does that mean that the impulse to use behaviors are the triggers and people have some real difficult moments trying to resist doing those behaviors because it's so embedded in everything? But um, I think that is the bar is to stop the behaviors, and then the rest will grow once those behaviors are stopped. Right, the changes will occur. Does it happen cleanly like that? No, not often, but that's the goal. But what we try to do is not shame people when that happens because it is part of the process in many ways. Especially, I think I'm thinking with meth, and I think probably any intensity addiction. I think sex and porn are the same thing. People just don't stop right away, right? It takes a hit or miss. It takes some getting up, falling, picking yourself back up, and moving forward, and really wanting it. But it's the thing I think to remember is that it's possible, and that we strive for it, and that we keep coming back, and we never give up, and people do it. I think the trap in that early days, thinking, well, nobody really does this. Nobody can do it. That's just not true. People do it. It takes time. Takes some. It's messy, but it can be done.
Yeah, and for you as a partner, focus on healing for you. Like, this is that person's journey. What do you need to do to take care of you through the concern and betrayal and everything else you've experienced? That would be your part of the journey. Okay, the last one is I just got on Zoloft and naltrexone and I'm tired, but I'm not tempted anymore. I like it. Is it safe or something I can be on all the time?
Um, yeah, if just want to obviously stay in touch with your doctor about it, but naltrexone is generally considered safe. And combining it with different things like antidepressants like Zoloft, um, or other in the case of methamphetamines, Wellbutrin, but that seems to be very potent in terms of reducing some of these risks and cravings and triggers. So yeah, I think it is. I think what I recommend is do it for a while. Kind of, it's almost like training wheels or get you through the urges, but then after a while, I think um, it's probably useful to try to back off it. But it's not. I'm not a doctor here, But I've had a lot of clients use these as prescribed by their doctors, and they've done really quite well over the long period of time too.
And I would hope in conjunction with other recovery work so that you're getting
Absolutely.
the
Yeah, yeah.
skill that, yeah, like just getting off a substance onto another substance. And again, I'm not a medical doctor either, but like we do things because we don't have the life skills. So getting your life skills shored up with recovery work, would be, just removing the temptation, helpful, but not necessarily going to give you the skills to navigate life, for the long haul. So, okay. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Dr. David. It was great to see you. So,
Same
Kristen
here. My
Snowden will be
pleasure.
on the second week in January, and we'll see Dr. David back again in February. Thanks, everyone.
Cool.
Happy holidays, Dr. David.
Take care. Thank you too.